All right. Hello to everyone coming into the session, into this Trendall lecture for 2022. We will just wait a couple of minutes or so while everybody who comes in would like to join, and then Gillian will start the proceedings. I think you can get going if you want, Gillian.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And welcome everybody to the 2022 Trendall Lecture, the 10th annual Trendall Lecture from the Trendall Research Centre at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Gillian Shepherd. I'm the Director of the Trendall Centre. Once again, we're using an online format for the Trendall Lecture. I hope in future we might be able to organise some sort of hybrid event so that those of us who are in Melbourne can return to the more sociable version of the Trendall Lecture that we used to have with the in-person event. But of course, the great advantage of having the lecture online is that people who can't normally be in Melbourne for this lecture can now attend. Now, many of us are scattered throughout Australia, so I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And I'd also like to extend a very special welcome to those of you who are outside Australia, especially if you've got up very early in the morning or it's some other unsociable hour in whatever time zone you're in. I know a lot of people who booked for the Trendall Lecture are in fact in the Northern Hemisphere, including, of course, our speaker Tiziana D'Angelo, who is joining us from Italy. Just before I do the proper introductions though, some housekeeping. We are recording this lecture for those who can't attend now, especially because of the time differences. But all registered attendees will receive a link to the lecture recording within the next few days or so. Because this is a webinar format, you, the audience, can't be seen, only the speakers. So you don't need to worry if you're concerned about appearing in a recording, you won't appear. There will also be a chance to ask some questions at the end of the lecture. So please type any questions or comments you have into the Q&A function. As you think of them, you can do this during the lecture, and we'll get through as many as possible as we can at the end. Now, we're also doing something a bit different this year. This lecture will also be put out in an edited form as an episode of the When in Rome podcast, which is hosted by Matt Smith, who I'd like to introduce to you here. Many of you, I'm sure, know Matt from that podcast or its twin podcast, Emperors of Rome. And if you're not already hooked on these podcasts, I strongly recommend you check them out. Matt's also a colleague at La Trobe, where he's Senior Communications Coordinator for La Trobe Asia, where, amongst other things, he also hosts and produces La Trobe Asia's podcast, Asia Rising. But we have also totally converted him to the ancient world. And you can also hear Matt's work from time to time on ABC Radio National. And I think you should also know that Matt's favourite dinosaur is the Stegosaurus. So our subject today is the fabulous site of Paestum in South Italy, known as Paestum today, but originally founded as Posidonia by the ancient Greeks around the end of the 7th century BCE. And if you haven't ever visited Paestum, then I really hope this event will whet your appetite to make that trip. It's an absolutely spectacular and fascinating site, and one that has special significance for the Trendall Centre, because Paestum was the place that inspired Dale Trendall to study South Italian red figure pottery when he first visited Italy in 1932. And his first book was called Paestum Pottery, and it was published in 1936. So Paestum really set him off on his life's work, and he always had a very special affection for the site. So it's also a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Tiziana D'Angelo. Tiziana and I first met back in 2018 at a fantastic conference at Paestum, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the tomb of the diver. So I was absolutely thrilled when I heard earlier this year that Tiziana had been appointed as director of the Archaeological Park of Paestum and Velia. Tiziana is also a classical archaeologist who specialises in the art and archaeology of Magna Graecia and pre-Roman Italy. She completed her first degree in classics at Pavia University in Italy and then went on to postgraduate study at Oxford and Harvard. She's had numerous fellowships, including at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. And she was also a lecturer in classical archaeology at Cambridge University. And before she took up her position at Paestum, she was assistant professor in ancient Greek and Roman art at Nottingham University. So now I'd like to hand over to Matt and Tiziana for Paestum, a Greek wonder in Italy. Take it away, Matt.
Thank you, Gillian. And now something which I will inevitably edit out, which is edit out of the end broadcast, which is I need to swap slides, I believe. So just bear with me for 1 second. There we go. We have a map. Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining us today, Tiziana. It's a great pleasure to speak to you.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. So thank you so much. Thanks, Gillian, for inviting me. It's, it's really a great honor. And I'd like really to kind of, make my own invitation to our audience to come and visit us to Paestum in Italy, and maybe, to discover Velia as well, which is another, fantastic, extraordinary Western Greek site. But yeah, so thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to start this proceedings by going through a few basic questions to situate the site of Paestum and to understand its significance. And these are going to be answered by Tiziana and Gillian. So just kind of a conversation kind of thing about the site and why it's important and why it's interesting. And I'm going to move my hands quite a lot less, I think, so that they're not blocking the screen so much. So Tiziana, if you could please begin us off with situating Paestum for us. We've got a nice map there, and where we're looking at there is Pasadena, isn't it? So can you tell us what the site is in Italy? And it's a Greek site. Why was Italy a good place for settlement?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in southern Italy, and we have to, when we think about Italy, of course, we think about Rome, we may think about the Etruscans, but actually, there's a whole side of Italy which is Greek. There's a Greekness in Italy, in particular in southern Italy, because that was the area that was colonized by the Greeks starting from the 8th century BC. So very much of the first millennium BC in southern Italy is kind of dominated by the Greek presence, dominated by Greek culture and Greek identity. As we can see on the map, there are a number of these sites, of these cities that are on the coast. That basically the coastal cities are the ones that area essentially is the one that was mostly colonized by the Greeks. And Poseidonia, so the city of Poseidon, was one of these Greek colonies. And yes, it's a Greek city, but what we have to think about this site as a very multicultural site. Its colonial aspect, its colonial identity influenced significantly its entire history, and not just its Greek history. As we can see, Poseidonia, so Paestum was founded as a Greek colony at the end of the 7th century BC, as I said, as Poseidonia, but it later turned into a Lucanian city, and later on it became a Latin colony. So different populations, different cultures. And as I said, it's precisely this, this colonial identity that very much influenced its development. So what we find there, as I said, is a city with different hearts. And when we walk through the site, one of its main features, probably its temples. So there are 3 magnificent temples, Greek Doric temples, that are still standing, and that's one of the things that impress our visitors the most. But there's, of course, a lot more to discover there. And what we realize by sort of looking at a bit further is that from the very beginning, so from the end of the 7th century BC, what we found in Poseidonia is this Greek population interacting with other Italic populations, and then later on with the Romans. Another thing that I think is important to say, just from the start, is that Poseidonia is a peculiar colony in the sense that its mother city is not in Greece. So this is, it's a colony of a colony. So we see a little bit further south on the Ionian coast, we see the city of Sybaris. And that was Poseidonia's mother city. So what happened is that Sybaris, which was a colony founded by the Greeks coming from mainland Greece, was founded, as I said, as a second colony. So the Greeks founded Sybaris, and then at some point at the end of the 7th century, a group of the Sybarites moved north and founded this new colony. So that's another aspect. That's another thing to think about when we try and reconstruct its history, when we try and understand also the development of its culture.
I was wondering if you could give me a bit more detail then about the size and layout of the city and what sort of features it had, and give me a sense of how important this was. It seemed to have been a quite significant colony on the coast of Italy, and quite a lot larger than the other ones in the immediate area. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so when we think about the region where Poseidonia is located, which is basically between Campania and Lucania, so that's an area where we find several other Greek colonies. That's where we find, even the earliest proper Greek colony, which we can also see on the map, and it's Cumae. So Cumae, Neapolis, so modern day Naples, Pithecusae, these are all Greek settlements. Poseidonia was sort of a good size city, founded right on the coast. It had a very important role when we think about like a commercial role, but it also played a very important role later on in terms of its interactions with the Romans, in terms of its role in the conflicts between the Macedonians, the Romans, these Italic populations. When we go to Paestum today, what we find is that the city is surrounded by walls that are very well preserved. Now, these walls are about 5 kilometers, just to give you like a sense of the of the kind of extension of the city. They were not built right at the start, so they were not built when the city was founded, but only at a later stage. But as I said, they give us a sense of its size. What is also very interesting is that what we recognize is that in the city, when the colonists arrived in this area and they founded this city, the first concern that they have was to define the public space. And that's a strip of land that is about 25 hectares essentially. And that's where we find, you can see what we see here on the slide are 2 of the 3 temples that are preserved, the 3 urban temples that are preserved in Paestum, the so-called Temple of Neptune and the so-called Basilica. And these are precisely located in that kind of strip of public space. So that, that was the most important part of the city. That's where we find, the sanctuaries. That's where we find the most important political buildings, political spaces, like the Ecclesiasterion, which was built in the early 5th century BC for political assemblies. That's where we find the Theron, which is the tomb, or rather the cenotaph, of the mythical founder of the city. So they're all located in this almost this central strip of land. And then east and west of this area, we find residential quarters. We find the houses. When we go west, those residential areas have been excavated, extensively. We know quite a lot about Roman houses. We know a bit less, but we're still, but still more and more about Greek houses. When we go east, instead of that, of this public space, and our knowledge is a little bit more limited. And the reason is the fact that Paestum had a long and continuous history. And in that particular area, modern houses were built. The museum was built. So, for example, the National Archaeological Museum at the moment is built on top of the ancient Greek site, probably, basically on top of part of the agora. So we know a little bit less about that area. And then when we go beyond those city walls, just right outside the city walls, that's where we discover a whole new city, the city of the dead, the cemeteries. And I can see Gillian is smiling because, that's very much, her, as her field, of course. There's so much that we can learn about this city from its cemeteries. There's so much that we can learn about Poseidonia, about the Lucanian city of Paestum, about the Latin colony, just, by investigating its tombs. And so we have these necropolis, we have these cemeteries that are essentially scattered all outside the city walls, some of them very close to the city walls, but others in a more peripheral areas. So even, 1.5 kilometers, away from the city walls. So as I said, the city of the living, as it were, and then the city of the dead.
I'm going to circle back to the tombs if I can in just a second, but in particular the temples, which I think dominate the skyline and the imagination when you think about Paestum as a site. So how has our knowledge of the temples changed over the years, and how does this inform our knowledge of how the Greeks were living in the area at the time? I mean, I noticed that when you talked about 2 of the temples in particular, you addressed them both as so-called. One is the so-called Basilica, the other is the so-called Temple of Poseidon, did you call it?
Yeah, Neptune. Yeah,
Temple of Neptune. Okay, yeah, it's Poseidon with a different hat on. So how has our knowledge of those changed and informed what we know about the area?
It has changed a lot, and it's really from we have to think that as I mentioned earlier, this site had a very long history, that cross millennia essentially, from the end of the 7th century BC all the way down to today. But at the same time, you have to think that from the medieval period, roughly, to the 18th century, the site experienced a gradual decline, and it got to a point that it was essentially forgotten. Which is very odd for us to come to terms with, right? It's very difficult for me because if you're thinking that those temples, they've not been excavated. It's not that they were buried. We're not dealing with a site like Pompeii or Herculaneum that had been buried and then were excavated in the 18th century and came back to light. I mean, those magnificent temples had always been there. So for us to think that, they were at some point forgotten is very strange. But that's precisely what happened, to the point that when in the 18th century, the phenomenon of the Grand Tour sort of exploded, right? So these young aristocrats from England, from Northern Europe, traveling to the Mediterranean in particular, traveling to Italy as part of their education. So it's only at some point in the 18th century that Paestum became one of the destinations of the Grand Tour. It wasn't at the beginning, precisely because there was next to no knowledge about it. People would go to Rome, and then people, they start, of course, then they went to Pompeii, they went to Herculaneum. But it was only after, a few very important artists and writers and philosophers, got there, then Paestum was, so to speak, rediscovered. And we're talking about, Winkelmann traveling to Paestum. We're talking about Goethe. We're talking about Piranesi. So in the 18th century, as part of the Grand Tour, we witnessed the rediscovery of this site. And when these visitors, when these grand tourists arrived to Paestum at first, they saw these magnificent Doric temples, and the first interpretations that were given of them were, of course, not accurate, and that's perfectly understandable. So, for example, so what we're looking at here is actually the Temple of Athena in the northern part of the city, but the two southern temples that I mentioned earlier. So. Yeah, there we go. The Temple of Neptune and the so-called Basilica. So the Temple of Neptune was not dedicated. Was not dedicated to Neptune. It was not dedicated to Poseidon. There's a bit of wishful thinking here. The idea is that since this is the city of Poseidonia, so it is the city of the sea god, the city of Poseidon. Then people thought, well, clearly that is the most monumental of these three temples, then it must have been dedicated to Poseidon. But today, thanks to the work of archaeologists, thanks to stratigraphic excavations, we know that is not the case. So the Temple of Neptune, as a matter of fact, was most likely dedicated to a goddess, not to a god, to a goddess who is extremely important for the Greeks of Poseidonia. And I'm talking about Hera, the goddess Hera, who was also worshipped outside the city walls in a very important sanctuary by the Sele River, so the sanctuary of Hera at Foce del Sele. So Temple of Neptune still keeps this nickname because, as I said, it's first interpretation. But nowadays we know, as I said, it was most likely dedicated to Hera. Someone is still considering the possibility that it was dedicated to Apollo. And as for the Basilica, that's another interesting story, because, of course, as I said, when these first visitors arrived to Paestum, what they found there was a temple that was missing the pediment. So, of course, the roof is not preserved, and that's fairly understandable. But unlike the Temple of Neptune, the so-called Basilica didn't even have a pediment. And that particular structure made it look like a Roman type of building, a Roman type of architecture. And we're talking about the Basilica. So Basilica not in the sense of a church, but Basilica in the sense of a particular type of building that was used for commercial activities, for judicial activities, and so on and so forth. So once again, it was soon they soon figured out that this indeed was not a basilica, but it was another temple. But again, the temple still keeps this nickname. So we refer to it as Temple of Hera II. So this is most likely another temple dedicated to Hera. So we're dealing with a sanctuary in this area that was probably dedicated to her. but it's still called so-called basilica. So that's a sort of these temples. So there's, as I said, this rediscovery, and then in the 18th century, and then you have to think that from the 20th century, extensive stratigraphic, so scientific stratigraphic excavations were carried out in the city, and even very recently, we had important excavations carried out, for example, at the Temple of Neptune. So our knowledge of these buildings actually changed significantly even in recent years. And what we realize, what these temples tell us about Poseidonia, they kind of tell us an interesting story. So these three temples, Temple of Athena, so-called Temple of Neptune, and so-called Basilica, were all built within less than a century, okay? Between roughly mid-6th and mid-5th century BC. The Temple of Neptune, the way we see it, is the most recent one. So it was completed roughly by the mid-5th century. But actually, so they tell us about a city that at that point was very much a construction site. So founded, it had been founded 50 years, prior to the beginning of the essentially, end of the 7th. Then you have to think that the building of the basilica started in the mid-6th, so about 50 years later. And that's, between the mid-6th and the mid-5th, that's when the city of Poseidonia was built. Streets were built, these temples were built. And this must have had a huge impact on the population as well. You have to think that these stone blocks, were carried, through the city, from the caves, from the quarries, to the city. You have to think that they were put in place using, some pretty sophisticated, considering that it was 6th century BC, but pretty sophisticated, machinery. So it's as I said, a city that was being built at that point, that was really trying to, and that also tells us a lot about its importance, about the kind of wealth that the city had, about its means. It tells us about also the workforce, because in order to build temples like that and so quickly, I don't know about you, but I always find it shocking that, these buildings, in some cases, they were all done within a couple of decades. And it's astonishing, that's, sometimes there are houses that take longer to be completed today. So this gives us a sense of the monumentality of the city already in the Archaic period and its importance.
Gillian, if I could draw you into the conversation, Tiziana mentioned the tombs not too long ago, and I know that that's an area of special interest of yours.
Yeah.
And I believe way back when we recorded an episode of When in Rome, just specifically on the tomb of the diver.
We did. Yeah. That was a long time ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you could take me through the tombs, so to speak, if you could tell me how impressive are the tombs that you find around the Paestum area, and what can they tell you about life in the area in particular? Because I know that there's some very distinctive features that you see when you consider that there's a Lucanian past to the site as well.
So it's fascinating. So like every ancient city, the cemeteries of Paestum are scattered outside the walls, and they're at sort of particular points, and to some degree there might even be some sort of social distinctions between them. For example, there's a rather isolated cemetery at a place called Ponte del Ferro, where the graves seem to be very poor. The bodies were covered with misshapen roof tiles that had been misfired, so they couldn't have ever been used as roof tiles. There's not much way in the way of grave goods. The bodies are just buried in sand. That seems to be quite a specific graveyard, possibly for some sort of subaltern group, although we need to do, all these cemeteries need some really important work on them. And then you've got a bunch of other cemeteries. One of the things I think is interesting, particularly for the Greek period at Paestum, is, and this is often commented on, that the tombs are relatively undifferentiated. You don't get an enormous variation that you do at other Greek sites, even in that period. So that could suggest not so much that the society at Paestum is fantastically egalitarian, but that there could be some sort of levelling ideology in place, whereby whatever your social identity during your life was, that is suppressed at death, and everybody is buried in a sort of a similar fashion. And that could even involve not just local custom, but even what's known as sumptuary legislation. In other words, there are laws on how you can get buried. That said, there is a bit of variation. It's a short spectrum, but there is a spectrum of sort of wealthy and less wealthy tombs. And there are indications that there was an interest in painting the insides of tombs at Paestum, and some of the cemeteries have produced these painted tombs. Most of them, and we're talking here maybe say the 5th century, are fairly plain. It's just the odd sort of stripe, red stripe or something like that, black stripe perhaps around the inside, but the interior is plastered, has this paintwork, and perhaps the grave goods might be a bit more exciting than they are in other tombs. But then we have this extraordinary exception so far, which is the tomb of the diver, where we have this quite elaborate symposium scene around the walls of the tomb. And we're talking about the inside of the tomb here. And then, of course, on the lid, this really enigmatic scene of this man jumping off some wall or tower or something into a body of water. And so far, nothing else like that has been found. I keep hoping maybe something else like that will appear at the site, but who knows what. But there must have been, I think, something really quite extraordinary about this individual, that he somehow qualified for this sort of tomb, and other people just didn't go that far normally. Then, of course, it all goes completely gangbusters when you get to the Lucanian period and the 4th century, when, as you can see on the slide here, there are the most fabulous painted tombs. Again, there are sort of a relative minority, if you like. I think, correct me, maybe there are about 80 painted tombs or something like that from that period. And there are more just completely plain ones. But nevertheless, the idea of painting a tomb really takes off at Paestum in the Lucanian period. So it's an absolutely fascinating area. And I think these tombs can really tell you an awful lot about ancient societies, but you do have to be very careful about how you read this material. Just because the tombs look similar doesn't mean that, as I said, they're all fabulous, necessarily mean it was a fabulously egalitarian society. I think we have to be a bit more careful and wide-ranging in the way we think about these sorts of things. But there's certainly a lot to find out about them.
And if I could ask just one more question, I think, before I turn it over to you, Tiziana, and that is, I'm interested to know if Paestum retained its Greek influences once it became Romanized, and if they were proud of their Greek heritage, if they continued using these temples, and if there was a noticeable Greekness around the space.
Yes, so for Paestum, we have a very specific date. We've got a date when the city becomes a Latin colony. For the foundation, we kind of say, end of the 7th, beginning of the 6th. For the Lucanian takeover of the city, we're also a bit uncertain. It must have been, a gradual process. We're not quite sure. But we do know that in 273 BC, the city becomes, a Latin colony. But this doesn't mean that everything changed overnight. The transformation, the cultural transformation, the social transformation of the city from Poseidonia to Paestum must have been very gradual. And also, what the archaeological evidence tells us is that the new population of Paestum, the post-273 inhabitants of Paestum, they were they were very clever about sort of negotiating the transition between the Greco-Lucanian identity of the city to the Roman. So, for example, the temples continued to be used. There's of course, a level of refunctionalization of the and transformation of the cult, but those three main temples, they continue to be used. At the moment, in Paestum, in an area that is very close to the western city walls, we actually found a new Doric temple. So we're excavating a fourth Doric temple, which is extremely exciting. It's much smaller than the ones that are preserved in the sort of more central part of the city. We're talking about a temple that is 8 meters by 12 meters. But it was built roughly at the same time as those three. So we're talking about early 5th century BC. We still have to, of course, we resumed the excavations this August, and we're currently working on it. But we can tell that we're talking about a temple that was built, as I said, 490, 480 BC, something along that line. And we do know that or at least the kind of the information that we're now getting from the materials on the site is that the temple was probably used until the Republican period. At some point, it was destroyed, or rather, the western facade collapsed, and it must have been, a sort of an accidental event. We're still trying to figure out, but the destruction of the western facade is linked to the collapse of a portion of the city walls. But we do know that it continued to be used. So there is a level of, sort of tension between continuity and change in the transition between the Greco-Lucanian phase of the city and the Roman one. And that is very important because, you can't just forget about your past. You need to come to terms with it. You need to some extent, to also, you need to basically take into account, the long history that the city had. So, for example, the Heron, so that's cenotaph, that tomb of the mythical founder of the Greek city, it was not destroyed by the Romans, which is something that, if you think about it, when the city became a Latin colony, it would have made sense, right? We're no longer Greek. The Greek founder, we should just forget about him. Let's destroy it. They didn't. What they did at some point, probably not immediately in the 3rd century, but a little bit later, is that they obliterated it. They sort of, covered it up. Okay. Same thing for the ecclesiasterion. So there's, as I said, I think it's a lot more complex, and it comes, basically it becomes a political issue. It becomes a cultural issue. We also have to remember that when it became a Latin colony, certainly part of these colonists must have come from Rome, or from other Roman cities. But it's not that the Greco-Lucanian population of Paestum was suddenly kicked out. Okay, so you can't just basically think about the history of Paestum, as I said, as having a Greek chapter, a Lucanian chapter, and a Roman chapter. It's a lot more complex and actually more interesting than that. And what we do know from ethnographic evidence, from archaeological evidence, is that actually a number of Lucanian families, we know that because they have Oscan names, a number of these families actually probably remained in power, and they maintained their privileged position. So clearly there was a lot of sort of negotiation and renegotiation of power after the city was incorporated, was annexed to Rome.
Okay, Tiziana, I'm now going to turn the proceedings over to you. So you've got some slides to load up, and just while we're doing a bit of a swap over right now, for those listening in the audience, a reminder that the Q&A is open. If you've got questions, you can put them in there. Also, if you would like to chat amongst yourselves, I've noticed that the chat is open. So please be courteous and behave, but that is open for your general discussion. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Tiziana, and I believe that I will hide my video as well.
Okay, so let me see. All right, so let me share my screen. Great. So we've talked a little bit about the tomb paintings from Paestum. Gillian, told us some sort of important details, about these paintings, also about their social and cultural value. What I want to do today with you is basically use these images, use these colors, use the Paestum paintings to think and rethink about the history of this city. Because actually, with funerary painting, we can follow this tradition from the end of the 6th century BC through the mid-3rd century BC. So to some extent, this artistic tradition, which developed and took up, very different forms. I mean, here you can see on the initial slides there are, three different paintings, and you can tell, they're, how different they are from each other. To the left, is the Tomb of the Diver. And it tells us about the Greek city. It's 5th century. Sort of an extraordinary and unique monument from the Greek period, from the Greek phase of the city. In the center, there's a 4th century painting. Actually a painting that was retrieved and excavated quite recently in 2011. And it shows us, or it tells us about the cultural changes and the cultural developments of the city during its Lucanian phase. And then to the right, what we see is that transition that we were talking about, that transformation of the city from a Greco-Lucanian site into a Latin colony. And thinking about the role that images and the role that that painting can have to understand and reconstruct the history of Paestum, is very much linked to the figure of Trendall as a man, as a scholar. What you can see here is actually an excerpt from an address that he gave in 1991 at Trobe University when he was conferred the degree of Doctor of Letters. And I quite like this because he emphasized, so first of all, he showed a sort of also a personal attachment to Western Greece, so to southern Italy, and implicitly to the site of Paestum. And he also speaks about the importance of this colonial identity of this city, which is not, does not characterize Paestum only during its, during the Greek phase of its history, but it really continues throughout the whole of the 1st millennium BC. So, I'm not going to be talking about vase painting, but I will be talking about wall painting. For the most part, actually, paintings that were executed, that were made roughly at the same time as the vase paintings that Trendall researched for most of his life. And I want to start, with this with the symbol, essentially, of the archaeological park of Paestum and Velia. That's the Tomb of the Diver. Gillian, introduced it as, a very mysterious monument, and it is true. You know, it's a tomb. It's a painted tomb that poses more questions than than the answers that it offers. What do we know about it? Well, we know that it was that it dates to the first decades of the 5th century BC. We can debate 480, 470. We know that it was found in a cemetery that was actually quite far from the city walls. It was 1.5 kilometers south of the city wall, so in a bit of a sort of more peripheral area. And it was it's a cist tomb, so it's a chest tomb, and it has its 4 walls plus the lid that were decorated. So this tomb was basically, the interior of the tomb was decorated on the 4 walls and on the cover slab. And it takes its name from this very famous scene, the scene of the dive. And we've got this young man, jumping off this, this column or pillar into a pond, or into the sea, or it's been interpreted in various ways. And it was discovered in 1968, and it's now more than 50 years later. It very much remains a mystery to us, the meaning of this particular scene. Here from reconstruction, you can get a sense of how the paintings were organized, as I said, on the interior walls and on the lid. The grave assemblage was very sober, precisely, or most likely because of that ideology, of that sort of, ideally like egalitarian. The egalitarian ideology that we seem to recognize in the city in the 5th century BC. And while on the lid we have this famous scene of the diver, the interior walls were decorated with a banquet scene. They were decorated with a symposium scene, and on the 2 long walls, we see the 3 couches on each of them. It's a banquet that is attended exclusively by men, which is not surprising in a Greek context. Precisely the idea of the symposium as an activity that was shared only by men. And then on the short walls, we see an attendant and 2 more male figures probably joining in the symposium. Lots of different interpretations have been given of this painting, and actually most recently, Tonio Hilscher has suggested a new one, which I personally find very convincing. So looking at the scene of the dive, not so much as a metaphor of the transition from life to the afterlife, but more, as an allusion, as a reference to a rite of passage. So a sort of a coming of age ritual that marks the transition from youth to adulthood. And so a suitable commemoration probably for a young man. But regardless of the meaning of these scenes, the reason why I want to look at this painted tomb today is to actually think about the late archaic and early classical history of the site. What is happening? Who is traveling to Poseidonia? What kind of interactions did the city have with other cities in southern Italy, or maybe in the Mediterranean? And I think this tomb offers us the possibility to think about these questions. So when we think about funerary painting in southern Italy, we do realize that the Tomb of the Diver is an exceptional monument. There's absolutely nothing like that anywhere else in southern Italy. Actually, I must say there's nothing like that anywhere else in the Mediterranean in the 5th century BC. So it really is unique. But this doesn't mean that the tradition of funerary painting, that a tradition of funerary painting did not exist in Magna Graecia. So what you have to think about is that there are a few sites, both Greek cities and Italic settlements, where painted tombs have been discovered. It's just a handful of sites, so there's not much. And most of these painted tombs, they feature a non-figural decoration, so just decorative motifs, not figural scenes. But they are, mostly concentrated in southeast Italy. So we've got painted tombs in Taranto. We've got some painted tombs in the Messapia region, so Cavallino and Lugento. Something else, a little bit more in northern Apulia, from the site of Rovo di Puglia. Then we've got Poseidonia and an isolated example from the Campania region, from Capua, and that's pretty much it. Now, what do these painted tombs have in common? Do they are they evidence of connections between these different parts of Magna Graecia? Do they tell us about contacts between different sites in the region? And most importantly, where does the tradition of funerary painting come from? Is it a colonial tradition? Is it very much of a Greek colonial tradition, so there's something original, or was it imported? And if so, where does it come from? So as Gillian was saying earlier, the Tomb of the Diver is unique. It is extraordinary. But actually, in Paestum, a handful of painted tombs have been found, and which date from the 5th century BC, so sort of prior to the Lucanian phase of the city. Here, there's a very important example, the so-called Tomb of the Palmettes, and what we can see is that the lid actually has the same frame, the same decorative frame as the Tomb of the Diver. The only difference is that there is no figural scene painted within this frame. Okay, but these examples, and here you see a couple more slabs. As you can see, just a very simple decoration, either entirely painted in red, or just a red podium with darker bands on top. So there are some examples, and it does show that we do have in Poseidonia a proper tradition of funerary painting. So it's much more than just an isolated example. And when we try and figure out where does this tradition come from, for this particular period, so for this early phase of funerary painting, the models that we should look at are not funerary, but most likely sacred. So probably the models for these painted tombs were the temples. And in terms of technique, in terms of decorative motifs, in terms of the pigments that were used, there are significant similarities between the 5th century painted tombs of Poseidonia and the evidence of wall painting that we have from sacred buildings. So, for example, the petrographic analysis has been carried out on, of course, the Tomb of the Diver, the Tomb of the Palmettes, but also certain samples from the Temple of Neptune and the so-called Basilica. And what we can see is that probably the same artists who painted the temples were the ones who were commissioned the decoration of these tombs. So at the time, at the time when the city was being built, that phase of monumentalization of the city, we have to think that individuals, most likely from aristocratic families, they, hired those masons. They hired, the same artists who were working on these buildings, on these public buildings, for the decoration of their tombs. But something like the Tomb of the Diver introduces a further problem, because there's a figural scene. There are very complex figural scenes, the banquet, and then the dive. Where does that come from? It's not enough to actually think exclusively about these artists or painters who are working on the temple. There's something else. And when we look for artistic models, when we look for a potential point of reference, we have to actually travel, or at least that's what I think. We should travel east. We should actually cross the Mediterranean, so from Western Greece, cross the Mediterranean and reach the western coast of modern-day Turkey, to reach what used to be the region of Ionia, and then the inland, the region of Anatolia. That's where we find a very rich tradition of wall painting as early as the 6th and 5th century BC. Greek artists, but also Lycian artists, they specialized in the decoration of tombs, temples, and houses. We have literary evidence telling us about it, but most importantly, we have some very rare and extremely interesting archaeological evidence. The Tatarlı tomb, the Karaburun tomb, the Kizilbel tomb. These are all magnificent painted tombs that date back to the late Archaic and early Classical period. But what do they have to do with the Tomb of the Diver? And and how could those artistic models reach Poseidonia from Turkey, so from the eastern Mediterranean? Very recently, in a recent article, Alan Shapiro has pointed out a very interesting similarity between the portrait, between the profile of an attendant, of the figure of an attendant that was painted on the rear wall of a tomb in Karaburun, in Anatolia, and the profile of a very famous figure that was painted inside the Tomb of the Diver, one of the so-called lovers. And the stylistic, the iconographic and stylistic similarity between these two figures is striking. It cannot be accidental. So, technical similarities, iconographic similarities, stylistic similarities, they make us think about potential influences. Now, I find this particularly interesting because in my search for the origins of South Italian funerary painting, and in particular of Paestum funerary painting, I simply could not find anything. And I was looking, I was looking for the models in Etruscan painting. I was looking probably not far enough. But in addition to the similarities between these Anatolian paintings and the Tomb of the Diver, there are also interesting iconographic connections with Ionian art more broadly. So, for example, the motif of the banquet, the motif of the symposium, was a very popular one, even in terracotta and stone sculpture in the Ionian region, so on the western coast of Turkey. So you should think about the terracotta frieze from Larissa on the Hermes. We can think about the decoration of the architrave of the Temple of Athena at Axos. So there are interesting, as I said, iconographic, stylistic, and technical similarities. That's great. It's all very interesting, but we still have to answer the question, how do we go from Ionia, how do we go from Anatolia to Poseidonia in the early 5th century BC? And that's where we go back to Poseidonia's mother city, Sybaris, in modern day Calabria. So on the coast of the Ionian Sea in southern Italy. We unfortunately, we don't know much about Sybaris because Sybaris was destroyed, completely destroyed in 510 BC after a war against Croton. But we do have plenty of literary sources telling us about this city. So what we can, we know that Sybaris had a very close connection with the city of Miletus in Ionia. We know in general that the link between, Sybaris and the Ionian region at the end of the 6th century was extremely strong. We also know that the cities of Ionia were attacked and conquered at the very beginning of the 5th century, and that caused a diaspora basically of also of artists that left Ionia and then moved across the Mediterranean, and we know that they also reached the shores of southern Italy. So this is very much of a suggestion, but one that I'm working on. What if the missing link to actually understand the origins of funerary painting in southern Italy? What if the missing link to reconstruct the history of painting in Poseidonia is indeed Sybaris? And we have, again, to think that when Sybaris was destroyed in 510 BC, again, it's whoever survived, essentially, most of the population, was killed, but those who survived, many of them actually, basically, they left and moved further north. And what we have to think that some of these people, and probably also artists, they must have reached Poseidonia, which was indeed a colony of Sybaris. So this is just a suggestion, but it's essentially to say that just thinking about these paintings, we can find out, or at least we can interrogate ourselves. We can try and reconstruct very important historical issues, historical aspects of the development of Poseidonia. And there we go. These are our lovers. But now I want to move to my second painting, and that leads us to travel in time from the early 5th century to the mid 4th century BC. Again, the development of funerary painting was uninterrupted. Yes, certainly there weren't many painted tombs in the late 5th century, but it was continuous. We shouldn't think about a sort of decline and then a reappearance. We have to think about a tradition that developed over time, that was transformed, that developed over time. And I want to talk about a tomb that was discovered in 2011. It was partially looted, and that is unfortunately an issue that we often have to deal with when it comes to painted tombs in Paestum. So in 2012, there was emergency excavation to retrieve the paintings from this semi-chamber tomb, and it comes from a cemetery north of the city walls, the so-called Gaudo necropolis, and this tomb is absolutely unique for a different reason from the tomb of the Dido. And actually, want to use it to think about a different question, which is, what was the role of funerary painting within the actual, funerary ideology? These are more than just images. It's not just a matter of, decorating a tomb. There's a lot more about these colors. There's a lot more to these images. And in particular, so here we have to think, so that even this tomb, this semi-chamber tomb, was entirely decorated. So on this, on the interior, so on its four walls, the lid in this case was not painted. Part of the grave assemblage was looted. Only a few pieces have been retrieved. What is special about this tomb is that it makes us think about the process of painting. So painting not just as a final product, but as an action. And this takes me to an exhibition that opened in Paestum at the National Archaeological Museum of Paestum in 2017, and it was about action painting. It was about rituals and art in the Paestum tombs. It basically thinks about, it basically uses the concept of action painting, which is linked to Jackson Pollock's technique and approach to art, whereby, as I said, painting is a process. The act of painting is part of the work of art itself. So it borrows this concept. And it's not just to say that Pollock's paintings and the Paestum paintings are the same. Of course not. But I think it changes completely our perspective in terms of what was the function of these paintings within the funerary ritual. What the archaeological evidence tells us is that most of these paintings, most certainly the ones from the 4th century BC, so the so-called Lucanian paintings, they were not painted in a workshop, which would have been the most logical thing to do, the easiest thing to do for an artist, right? I mean, you paint a slab, in the workshop, and then when it's done, you just go and place it into the ground. But that's not what happened. The paintings must have been executed in situ. Immediately prior, or even during the funerary ceremony, that we don't know for certain. Now, how do we know that? We know because some of these painted slabs, they show, for example, sort of smudges, right? Some of the areas of the paint are, damaged in a way that suggests that when the damage occurred when the paint was still wet. It could be, for example, that the paint was still wet when the body of the deceased was placed inside the tomb. Or it could have been that it started raining while the paintings while the tombs were being decorated. But as I said, it suggests that the paintings were executed in situ. And that is also confirmed by the fact that in some of the paintings, we can see that the coat of plaster that was applied as a sort of the plaster that was applied before the paint before the paint was applied, it goes over the edge between adjoining slabs. So we know for sure that the slabs were placed into the ground before the plaster, the coat of plaster was applied. And so that again suggests that first the slabs were placed into the ground, and then the tomb was decorated. Now, this is important, as I said, because it transformed this painting into, part of the funerary ceremony, into, part of the funerary ritual. And this tomb from the Gaudo and Acropolis, in particular from the Spina Gaudo area, is particularly significant because in some places on at least 2 of the painted walls, some scientific analysis, they've shown the presence of traces of textile on the wall itself. So traces of textile both on the north and on the east wall. And we're talking about, these samples have been analyzed, and we are dealing basically what we can identify as animal wool. And this probably, this tells us about, most likely the presence of a shroud that covered the body of the deceased. And when the deceased was then placed inside the tomb, then this textile would have touched the painted walls. And that's how, basically 2,000 years later, we still have traces of this wall there. So this is extremely important. And then a final detail that I would like to mention about this tomb is a peculiarity that shows how complex this site, this city was from a cultural point of view. So one of the long walls was decorated with a prophecies scene, so the laying out of the body. This was most likely the tomb of a woman, and what we see on the walls is a scene where we see the body of the female deceased that was during basically a scene of lamentation. But there's a very peculiar figure that is kind of standing, it looks like, behind the deathbed. And when we look at it more closely, what we see is that this large face is not just the face of another woman. We see that the hair, they almost look like, little snakes. This almost looks like like a gorgon, like a Medusa, but it's not the kind of standard iconography of a Greek. The standard Greek iconography of Medusa. It's something different. It's something that shows the peculiarity of Lucanian culture, the peculiarity of a culture that was interacting very closely with the Greeks, but it also developed its own unique and its own peculiar identity. And then finally, my third painting will take us to the Roman phase of the city. So in our kind of history, in our sort of journey through the history of Paestum, and it's a very famous tomb, another one that had been looted, unfortunately. But again, it's a very positive story in this respect, because these tombs, actually over 30 blocks of this chamber tomb, this painted chamber tomb, were recovered by the Guardia di Finanza, which is Italy's fiscal police, in 1976 in the city of Taranto, as they were about to be shipped abroad. And so that's why this tomb is still conventionally called Tomba del Sequestro della Finanza. And the tomb, after these blocks were retrieved and others were still found in situ, it was rebuilt, reassembled inside the National Archaeological Museum, where you can still admire it today. And this tomb was traditionally dated to the first quarter of the 3rd century BC, to the kind of end of the Lucanian phase of the city. And the idea behind this, this interpretation was that funerary painting in Paestum had to be Lucanian. it couldn't be, Roman. So this artistic tradition had to end before the introduction of the Latin colony. It comes from a cemetery that is about 1.5 kilometers from south of the city walls, the Spinazzo necropolis. It was in use from the Archaic period through the late 4th century, and then over 150 burials have been excavated there. And among these burials, we have nine painted chamber tombs, and one of them is precisely the Tomba del Sequestro della Finanza. Now, as I said, originally dated to the first quarter of the 3rd century, so a pre-Roman phase. Well, this dating has been questioned, and new evidence and a reassessment of old evidence as well suggests a later dating. So we're talking about numismatic evidence, so coinage with a Latin legend. So the Paestum coins that were found in 2 of these painted tombs. They've been studied, and they can be confidently dated to a phase immediately after the introduction of the Latin colony. Now, this is not just a detail about dating. This is very important because it again tells us something about the history of the site. It tells us something about the transformation of the city from a Greek into a Lucanian into a Roman city. And this transformation was very much gradual. So when the city when the Latin colony of Paestum was conducted in 273 BC, the transformation of the city into a Roman site was very gradual. The Forum was not built immediately. The 3rd century is very much of a transitional phase. At the same time, the Greco-Lucanian past of the city was not just suddenly obliterated. It must have taken time. It's not until the 2nd or 1st century BC that the Heron, so the tomb of the mythical Greek founder of the city, was obliterated. Same thing for the Ecclesias Arion, a very sort of symbolic monument that belonged to the Greek city. So it's very interesting then to turn to paintings to try and reconstruct this phase. Another thing to think about is that we know that the population, as I said, did not simply change suddenly. We know that some of those Lucanian families remained in power even after the city was transformed into a Latin colony. And we can tell from the presence of Oscan names both on pottery and in coinage. And if we turn to that tomb, to the Tomba del Sequestro della Finanza, to try and make sense of this, of this very crucial moment in the history of the site, there's quite a bit that the images painted on those walls can tell us. So it's a chamber tomb. As we enter, on the left side, what we see is essentially a processional scene. We see horses, and it's a reference most likely to a journey to the afterlife. It's a reference to the funerary procession. To the right, instead, what we see is a rider being greeted by a woman who's kind of offering him a vessel, a fiali. And the man is dressed in civic garments, and that is very interesting. So to the right, what we see is a commemoration, most likely, of the deceased, so represented, in its kind of civic and political role. And then the most important scene on the rear wall, we have two standing figures, again dressed in civic garments, in what looks like sort of in white tunics that look like toga, they are adjoining the right hand in a gesture that can be linked to the Roman gesture of the fides or the Greek gesture of the dexiosis. Are these, who are these men? They look like they're dressed like Romans. Is that true? I mean, this is not the way in which the Lucanians, the Lucanian aristocrats normally represented themselves. They enjoyed portraying themselves as riders, as warriors. But in this case, the civic role of these figures is what seems to play a crucial role. But there are additional details. So they're wearing these tunics, and yet they seem still to be wearing a belt that can be identified as a Samnite belt. So there's almost a sort of combination of Roman and Lucanian elements. And this, the particular iconography that we find on the rear wall of the Tomba del Sequestro della Finanza is the same iconography that we find in all the other contemporaneous tombs from the painted tombs from the Spinazza Acropolis. And it can be, in some cases, it can be two male figures adjoining their right hands. In other cases, it can be two female figures. In other cases, it could be a man and a woman. And the analysis of the osteological evidence from these tombs, combined with the paintings, lead us to actually identify the right figure on the rear wall as an ancestor, and instead the left figure as the actual deceased. So what we would have there on the rear wall is really the kind of meeting between two generations. And these two generations, they kind of belong to two very different historical phases of that city. That kind of transition, as I said, from the Greco-Lucanian city to the Roman city is reflected also in the combination of, for example, of certain iconographic elements, the Samnite belt on the one hand, the toga-like garments on the other. And the fact that that particular scene is a reference to the journey of the deceased to the underworld, and the deceased then being welcomed by an ancestor is confirmed by contemporaneous Etruscan tombs as well. So there are tombs, for example, 3rd century tombs in Tarquinia that have similar iconography, but with very explicit reference to the crossing of basically the journey to Hades. And this kind of negotiation between past and present can be reconstructed in the paintings. I mentioned the Samnite belt, but even the garment, even the dress worn by the female figure on the right wall of the Tomba del Sequestro della Finanza, with those two red vertical stripes, is a clear reference to a local Italic dress. So what we have here in the mid-3rd century BC, with the first generation, essentially, of the Latin colony, essentially, what we see is really this dialogue between past and present, between the Greco-Lucanian city and the Latin one, and the Latin colony. And this can all be reconstructed by sort of thinking and reassessing the painted decoration of these two. So what we've really done, just very quickly today, is to kind of travel in time from the very beginning of the 5th century BC to the mid-3rd century BC, and using the extraordinary tradition of funerary painting in the city, we've been able to think about very important questions that have to do with the political, cultural, and social identity of the city from its Greek through its Roman phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiziana, for that whirlwind and quite interesting tour through the tomb paintings of Paestum. Gillian, I'm sure you even learned something in that you didn't know. And she just went. I've got two quick questions before I pass it back over to Gillian to wrap up proceedings, Tiziana. And these come from the Q&A. And one specifically says, and this will give you a good opportunity to promote the excellent museum there, which is, are any of the tombs open to the public? And I imagine that is all the good stuff is in the museum there, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, this is a very good question, because so it gives me the opportunity to first of all say that we've got about 480 painted slabs, and that means about 130, 140 tombs, and that is an estimate, because of course in some cases we've got just one slab per tomb, but roughly a little bit less than 150 tombs. Now many of them are displayed in the museum, so they can actually be admired right there. The Tomb of the Diver has its own room, so it's just displayed there, an entire room just for that. And then the Lucanian tomb paintings, they have basically an entire room for them. But on top of the numerous painted tombs that can be admired in the museum, we've got hundreds of slabs that are preserved, that are held in our storage. And you would think, oh, that's really unfortunate because storage is not accessible. But actually it is, because we have this, we've actually opened up, we have this this program called Beyond the Museum. And so we opened part of the storage to the public. So we hold daily guided tours of the deposits. We've got 2 of them during the week, and then 2 per day on weekdays, and then 4 per day on weekends. And that is an opportunity for the public to actually walk through the storage, to kind of see a different to see these paintings in a very different context, look at them, as they're being conserved, look at them, after maybe they've just come out of the ground. So it's almost, a kind of, looking at what happens behind closed doors, so to speak. So basically, yeah, so they're all, the majority of them are accessible daily then to the public. And then a few of them that are held in the part of storage that is not opened daily, they can still be, of course, they can still be, if people are interested in looking at them, they can still be seen, in particular for, for research reasons, for study reasons. But we've got plenty, as I said, that that can be seen daily, like hundreds and hundreds between storage and the museum.
And how are you looking forward to the site of Paestum developing? You've just taken up your post this year, and I'm sure that you've got a shopping list of things that you'd like to get to.
Yeah. So these days, we're actually, it's end of the year, of course, which is always critical. But so we are since 2019, there have been works of, there's been a reinstallation works going on in the museum, and we are now reaching the end. So in the very first days of 2023, we plan to reopen the majority of the museum, and then by March, the whole museum will be reopened to the public. Because at the moment, like right now, only the painted tombs section and the Tomb of the Diver section they can be visited at the moment. But as I said, within a couple of weeks, things will be changing. So we've been working quite hard on the new installation, which was this was a very important project, because you have to think, it was a very much needed project, because you have to think that the museum was inaugurated in 1952. Even though there have been, quite a few changes, but still, it was, we needed to kind of give it a new face. It was important. On the one hand, that, then we also have as I mentioned earlier, the excavations of the historic temple. We have several excavation projects that are underway. We also have a project that is going on at the moment of restructuring and requalification of a former tomato factory that will be turned into another part, as it were, of the museum. So that's, it's all very exciting. So also we're planning an exhibition that will open up in May 2023. But that is not about Paestum. That will be about the site of Velia, which was annexed to the Archaeological Park of Paestum and Velia in February 2020. And so we have this exhibition coming up in May. So yeah, quite a few things that we're working on.
All very busy, and it sounds like a good topic for a future podcast then.
Absolutely.
I'll now turn the proceedings over to Gillian to wrap up. Thanks everyone for coming from my perspective, and thanks very much for your time, Tiziana. And it's great to see all the comments and questions that we've been getting, and sorry we didn't get to go to them all, but quite a few people who had visited Paestum recently, and quite a few are now putting it on their list of sites to go and visit. So hopefully you'll get a few extra visitors coming through there soon that have listened to this event. So thank you very much. Over to you, Gillian.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks from me to Tiziana. That was absolutely fascinating, and I certainly did learn a lot, and I'm dying to see this new Doric temple. Apart from anything else, it's absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you were this, Tiziana, but you mentioned Jackson Pollock, and that was a fascinating point you made. Jackson Pollock has particular resonance, should we say, for us in Australia, because in the 1970s, the then Whitlam government paid what was deemed to be a scandalous amount of money for his very famous painting Blue Poles, which is now one of the great treasures of the Australian gallery. So it has a lot of resonance here. And I've been looking certainly at the chat, and a lot of people seem to be now planning on going to Paestum, so we'll get there. They'll get there, and we can see the new museum. I must say, the first time I went, not only was it pouring with rain, but the temples were covered in scaffolding. So it's just got better and better ever since. Now on the slide here, you can just see a bit of information. If you're not already a friend of the Trendall Centre, but you'd like to find out a bit more about the Trendall Centre and its events, do please join us via the link, which you can see on the screen, or just Google Trendall Centre and you'll find our webpage with the link. It's free to join, and we'd love to keep in touch with you. And especially now, after 2 years of pandemic, we're all really into Zoom, so we're planning on more online events. And also do remember to check out the When in Rome and Emperors of Rome podcasts if you haven't already. Finally, I'd just like to say another huge thank you to Tiziana for an absolutely fascinating lecture. Also to Matt for his hosting, and also behind the scenes, the wonderful Diana Heatherich, who is back there organising and managing all that scary tech stuff, and we absolutely could not do without her. It's really reassuring to have her. This online format doesn't allow everybody in the audience to show their appreciation for Tiziana's wonderful lecture in the normal way, but there are some lovely comments coming into the chat, so I know all that appreciation is out there. And thank you once again from the Trendall Centre, Tiziana. And thank you, the audience, everyone, for attending. Stay safe and well, and all the best for the holiday season and 2023. And we hope to see you again next year, but goodbye for now. Bye.
Salve.
Salve.